When I was 19 years old, I got into a bit of a fight with my stepfather. It was a long time ago, but even now, I still think I was more right than he was. He was a bit of an asshole, and ever since he moved in, he always tried his best to get me and my brother out of the house. He always, however, bent backwards to make sure that my sister could stay as long as she wanted. But I digress. As a result of this huge fight, I had to find myself a roommate pretty quickly. There was no way I could afford to get a place all by myself. After a few weeks of looking, I found a roommate in Chicago, renting a room I knew I could afford. I was lucky to also find someone I thought I would get along with just fine. This guy, named TJ, seemed to like me, and he was an actor as well. We liked the same types of movies, had the same hobbies. We had a lot of things in common, honestly. When I moved in, though, it didn't take me very long to realize I had completely misjudged TJ. Even though I was paying as much as he was in rent, he constantly lorded it over me that since I was not on the lease, it was his apartment, not mine, and he could do whatever he wanted. When I had first moved in, we had agreed upon a set of rules which I thought were pretty fair, but I hadn't been there for more than a week when he began to amend the rules to be much more in his favor than mine. He also became very sullen, and although I kept to myself mostly, he would always groan whenever I got home from work and complain. It was as if he thought me being there at all was an inconvenience. It sure wasn't an inconvenience whenever I gave him the rent check, though. I had been talking to a friend of mine named John, who insisted I should just move out. I was completely unhappy there, and he wanted me to just leave. I told him, though, that I was way too nervous about approaching TJ about wanting to leave when I was only a single month into living there. John told me that I shouldn't even tell him I was leaving. I should just grab my things and leave overnight, or perhaps when he was at school. I really couldn't see myself doing that, though. The straw that finally broke the camel's back was one night when TJ tried to get me involved in a threesome with some random person he invited over. I was disgusted at the idea and told him I wasn't interested. He began to treat me as if I was a bad person at that point, and he completely held it against me from then on. I should have taken John's advice and moved out when he was at school, but for some reason I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I really didn't want to have to face him either, though, so instead, like an idiot, I wrote a note. I put the note on TJ's bed, telling him I was giving him 30 days and then I was promptly moving out. Then I went to bed. In the middle of the night, I was suddenly woken up by TJ slamming on my bedroom door. I had the door locked, and he was demanding I let him in. I refused since it was obvious he was quite angry. He was pounding and screaming. I went to pick up the phone because I thought I should call the police. However, before I even had the chance to, he actually broke down the door. I was so surprised I dropped my phone. TJ ran over and grabbed my shirt. He then began to scream in my face. He was telling me that I would have to keep paying half the rent for as long as he wanted me to, and all sorts of other obscene things. He then slammed me against the wall and hit my head against it. My senses went all fuzzy for a moment. Before I even knew what was going on, he grabbed a glass of water off my nightstand and smacked me on the forehead with it, shattering the glass. Both myself and the bed were now completely covered in shattered glass. I was too woozy to even react. TJ's rage just pushed him on. While I was trying to recover from his initial hit, he grabbed me again and began to strangle me. I knew I had to do something, or this psychopath was gonna kill me. I reached up and slammed him in the nose. I had no leverage, of course, but I think he was so shocked I'd punched him at all that he let me go. I got up and the glass fell off of me. I decided the best thing was to try and get out of the house as soon as possible. I sprinted out into the hallway before he grabbed me from behind. My fight or flight reversed its direction. I turned around and punched him 3 times right in the center of his nose. He fell back onto his ass, and I ran outside the apartment. I had to call the police to escort me in, to move my things out afterward. Since there were no witnesses to the event, the police said it was just TJ's word against mine. It really irritated me. That jerk should have gone to jail for what he did. Hell, when I told the police officers about the glass, he had the audacity to say I'd thrown it. Then why was my bed now covered in glass? I don't know. Well, afterwards, I was able to find an efficient apartment for a cheap price that I could move into alone and soon. I guess I really should have just taken my friend John's advice and left while he wasn't home. There are always some things that everyone associates with the different seasons. You have snow in winter, everything comes back to life in the spring, you see baseball in the summer, and most people associate cool air and leaves turning brown and falling from the trees with autumn. Not me though. I always knew fall as the time when the walker came back. The walker was a nickname that we gave to this guy who, you guessed it, we would always see going for a walk every evening during the fall. He seemed to be an older man, but not like a senior or anything, maybe in his late 40s or so. Starting on the autumnal equinox, he would begin taking a walk around the neighborhood. Every time about an hour before sunset. He would keep this up all the way into the winter solstice. No kidding, right? Then he would suddenly stop. I remember him from when I was about 5 years old, and it never failed. He would do this in the same way at the same time every single year. We never even got to talk to the man, and I never saw anyone approach him at all. He never even looked at us when he was out for his walk. Of course, when you have someone like that in your neighborhood, both adults and children begin telling stories about them. You know, people like to spread nonsense about those antisocial types. The rumors about this guy range from being a simple man whose wife died in the fall to him being a psychotic war veteran out on the prowl. Among us children, however, the stories were a bit more severe. Some people claimed he was a child molester or even a child murderer out searching for more victims. Some of the more imaginative kids thought he might be some sort of monster in disguise. There was a very popular story amongst my friends that the man was a werewolf who was depressed because he'd killed his wife and as a result spent the fall days walking around the block mourning her. Well, I only gave the stories about as much validity as any kid might have, or any rational kid at least. That is to say, I didn't believe them, of course. To me, I always just thought he was a guy who probably liked the fall and went for a walk after he got off work. He probably didn't like it when it was hot or really cold weather, so he didn't go during the winter or summer. Seemed perfectly reasonable to me. Everything everyone else said about him was just them making up stories about someone they didn't know to excite themselves. When I was 13, my friends and I were playing at the park. It was in the fall and the leaves had already been falling for weeks. We were playing some no-rules football. Off in the distance, one of my friends noticed that the walker was coming in our direction. My friends began making all sorts of mean comments about him. They were calling him a freak amongst other unflattering names. I told my friends to stop it. He was just a guy going for a walk through the neighborhood. I told them to stop spreading such harsh lies about him. Of course, my friends took offense to this. You know how kids are. When you challenge their misinformation, they'll try fiercely to defend it. Basically, one of my friends said this to me. Well, if you don't believe that guy is a psychopath, why don't you go up and talk to him then? I really didn't want to, but I guess I really didn't have an excuse at this point, so I said I would. As the walker got close to the park, I slowly began to move up to him. Actually, I felt a little bit scared, but I wasn't sure why. I guess it was just apprehension about talking to someone I'd never spoken to before. Anyway, I walked right up to him, gave him a friendly smile, and said, "Hey man, how's it going?" Quicker than I thought possible, the man suddenly grabbed me by my arm. With his other hand, he pulled something out of his jacket pocket and stabbed me in the arm with it. My friends saw what was happening, and they ran towards the walker, screaming at him. He let go of me and promptly ran off into the distance. A couple of my friends threw rocks after him. When I saw what the man had stuck in my arm, I almost had a heart attack. It was a dirty, filthy syringe, and he had stuck it deep. It scared the crap out of me. I had to have my mom take me to the hospital, and we called the police as well. Apparently, it was a used heroin needle. I was very lucky to not have contracted any sort of disease, although they did find some traces of heroin in my system. The guy was arrested, of course, and we pressed charges very firmly. You know, it's kind of funny. You try to be a good person, and then you realize that those people not being good people were the ones who ended up being right all along. So who really was good in the end? I really love apples. I live really close to a local apple orchard. Every fall, the orchard allows people to pay a fee, come in and pick their own apples. It's pretty fun, and you can get quite a lot for a very cheap price. The biggest problem, though, is that the orchard is so popular that when it first opens to the public in fall, it gets extremely crowded. I hate being around so many people. It really just makes me nervous. However, if you don't get to the orchard early on the first few days of opening, you'll miss out on all the best apples. So, one fall, I thought I had an ingenious, if not completely illegal and unethical idea as to how I could get the exact apples I wanted. My uncle is one of those anti-government militia type guys. He had a pair of night vision goggles. I thought I'd borrow those for a bit, sneak into the orchard, get the apples I want, then come back the next day and pay the fee. The orchard wasn't really protected in any serious way. I could get in very easily. I couldn't take a flashlight with me though, because that would certainly give me away. So, hence the goggles. I have to tell you, if you've never used them before, they're pretty damn awesome. It's not really like you see in the movies though. Everything is much sharper and cleaner than you'd see in a film. It's amazing what you can see, and how clearly you can see it. Anyway, I snuck into the orchard with no problem. I had my big bushel basket, and went about picking the apples I wanted. I had been in the orchard for a little over 30 minutes, when I climbed up onto one of the trees to get some apples that hadn't fallen off yet. That's when I heard what sounded like rustling in the leaves covering the ground. Alarmed, I turned around and saw the hugest, scariest looking man I had ever seen in my life. He was really tall and fat, and was carrying a flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other. I froze in the tree, immediately regretting being the stupid idiot I was for doing this in the first place. I tried to remain still so the man wouldn't shine the light over me. I had no idea if he worked there, or if maybe he had broken in like me. Either way, while he was walking around with a knife in his hand in pitch black night, I really didn't want to find out. The man came closer and closer, shining the light around. It took every ounce of control I had to keep myself from making noise. This got harder and harder as the man came closer and closer. After a while, he finally made it over to the tree I was in. I had to do everything I could to not shake the tree, because I was definitely shaking myself. I watched as he went over to my basket, looked at it, then swept the area with the light. He stood there for a moment. I swear to God, I thought I was going to pee myself right then and there. It took everything I could manage to keep myself from moving. I kept waiting for the man to shine his light directly up at me. I just knew he would. But after a minute that seemed to last for several hours, he simply kicked my basket over, scattering the apples all over the ground. He began walking off in a different direction, obviously looking for me somewhere else. I didn't know how long I waited there after the man left. I wanted to get down out of the tree right away and get the hell out of that orchard, but I thought that if I did, he would be on his way back and catch me. After a very long period of waiting, I did slowly climb out of the tree, very quietly grabbed my basket, and carefully made my way out of the orchard. As my feet crushed every leaf, I was scared. I jumped thinking the man would come rushing back for me. But I got out of there okay in the end. Now, if that wasn't scary enough, the next day when I went to the orchard prepared to pay my fee, it was closed. The old man who owned the orchard and lived in a farmhouse right on the side of it had been stabbed to death the previous night. It seemed I got my answer as to whether or not the man I'd seen worked there. Obviously, he did not. And yes, lest you think otherwise, I did immediately give a description to the police. As far as I'm aware though, they never caught the guy. But at least they didn't think it was me that had done it. My best friend growing up was a guy named Joey. We were friends for as long as I could remember. Starting back when we were around 8 years old, we started the age-old ritual of having sleepovers. We'd have one at least once a month. Strange thing was, though, all the sleepovers were always at my house. I never really thought about it much until I was around 11 years old. We were talking about having a sleepover on Halloween, which was only a few weeks away. Joey began asking me what my mom would be making for our Halloween dinner. It was then that I finally brought it up to Joey. I asked him why we never had sleepovers at his place instead. Right away, he seemed like he didn't really want to talk about sleepovers anymore. He just changed the subject. I didn't want to press it at the time, so I just let it go. A couple of days later after school, Joey and I were walking home together. I remember this very vividly because it was one of those days when the leaves were constantly falling from the trees, almost like it was raining down. Joey told me he was sorry he hadn't answered my question the other day. He said he never wanted anyone to come over to his house overnight because he believed that his shed was haunted. I was a bit confused. I had heard stories of houses being haunted. I had heard of schools and theaters being haunted, but I'd never heard of anyone saying a haunted shed existed. I wondered, even if this shed was haunted, why would that keep him from wanting to have a sleepover at his place? He told me that the only time he had seen the ghost was when his older brother had sleepovers, so he thought it would happen too if he had anyone over as well. Still, he told me he wanted to stay at my place, and if I ever wanted to stay over during the weekend, he would be fine with trying it out at least once. So, that Friday night, instead of going home, I walked with Joey over to his house. Although I hadn't ever slept there, I had hung out with him several times. We had a good and pretty fun evening. I didn't want to piss him off, but I was really super curious about the ghosts. After we were alone and watching some movies, I asked Joey to tell me a bit more about what was going on. Immediately, he didn't seem like he was having such a good time anymore. "It's in the shed," Joey said. "If you want to watch the shed from my bedroom window, I guess you can." I sort of did want to, but I also sort of didn't. I could tell, though, that talking about it was really upsetting my best friend, so we just went back to enjoying ourselves. When we went to sleep in Joey's room, he fell asleep pretty quickly. I was hanging out in my sleeping bag, and I just couldn't get the idea of that ghost out of my head. Now, I didn't necessarily believe in ghosts myself. I thought that whatever Joey had seen, there must be another explanation for it. Anyway, as soon as I was sure he was asleep, I went and peeked out that window. There was a light from the back of the house that shone on the backyard, right towards that shed. I sat there for about 10 minutes, wondering what it was my friend had seen. If this ghost only appeared on sleepover nights, it made sense to me that it was probably just Joey's brother trying to scare him. I sat there for another 10 minutes before I decided to give up and go back to bed. Immediately as soon as I started to turn around, though, I saw something in the backyard. I could tell it was a humanoid figure wearing nothing but a pair of shorts, crawling from the backyard on their hands and knees. They moved very slowly, deliberately, with these weird jerky movements. They made their way over to the shed, pried the doors open, and slipped silently inside. Needless to say, I was now absolutely freaked out. I quickly went over to my sleeping bag, crawled in, and pulled it over my head. It took me forever to fall asleep, and when I did, it was not a restful one either. The next morning, I told Joey about what I'd seen. He confirmed that this is what he'd seen the previous times as well. Now, an 11-year-old is probably a lot more likely than an adult to believe they actually saw a ghost. I was freaked out. As mentioned before, this only seemed to happen on sleepover nights. Joey had an older brother, and looking back, I wouldn't be surprised if it was some sort of prank of his. But when we went to check the next day, we couldn't find any signs of someone being there. It was so strange. Maybe it really was a ghost. This story is not safe for work. This happened around the early 70s or so, very early. My family, including my uncle by marriage, were all born and raised in the same tiny area in the deep south. This story is still told at family reunions and similar occasions, and I have full permission to share this as well. My uncle went away, fought in Vietnam, returned home, and he and my aunt, who was my dad's older sister, were married. While my uncle was in Vietnam, he said when something bad was going to happen, like something awful to one of his friends over there, or when there was a bad battle with his company, he would always feel it beforehand. There would just be a terrible sense of dread. Sometimes he would have that dread for a week or so before anything happened. Sometimes it would appear an hour before, or anywhere in between. It was January or February sometime, and the weather had been unseasonably warm that year. My aunt and uncle had only been married a few months, and he was going to go out of town the following day after this incident happened for something job-related. That meant he would have been gone for 2 weeks. He and my aunt were not looking forward to being apart. So it's a Sunday, and they decided to make that day very special. He went to church with her, which was something he rarely did. And they decided to splurge and eat at one of our great seafood restaurants. Afterward, they were going to take a romantic walk on the beach. My aunt said they were having such a great time, seeing old friends at church, going to that good restaurant. It was one of those days where everything seemed to be going absolutely perfectly. On the way to the beach they were headed to, though, my uncle began to have that same sense of dread, just the same as he'd had when he was in Vietnam. He didn't want to spoil my aunt's fun. He was beginning to suspect it might be something like what they call now PTSD. Back then, it was called flashbacks. He was trying not to let it bother him because of this, but the sense of foreboding was getting so bad. They arrived at the beach. To explain something about this particular beach, he had to park beside the road and walk across a wide expanse of sand to get to the water. This beach was also very secluded, especially in winter. My aunt was walking, collecting shells and having a great time. They saw another young couple walking also. My aunt and uncle didn't know them. They seemed to be late teens in age. All of a sudden, my uncle couldn't fight that bad feeling any longer. He grabbed my aunt by the arm and said, "Let's get out of here." She got mad, of course, saying she wasn't ready to go yet, but he started to drag her across the sand towards their car, arguing the whole way. He didn't tell her what was wrong. I guess even he felt he was probably just having a flashback, but he said he felt 100% better once they were back in the car and headed home. My aunt very quickly got over being mad as well. As they were driving, a large car with 4 guys in it passed them on the road, heading down towards that beach. Anyway, the story in the newspapers the following day, my uncle realized why he'd had such a bad feeling. Those 4 guys kidnapped the guy and his girlfriend. They were on some sort of drugs. They put the guy in the trunk and took his woman out and assaulted her for hours. They had a gun and kidnapped them from the beach at gunpoint. This shocked the whole area because it had always been very low crime. If my aunt and uncle would have stayed on that beach, there's no telling what would have happened to her, and they probably would have shot him. He would have fought to try and give her a chance to get away. The law had been looking for these 4 guys all day because the guys had also gotten into some other mischief the day before. They had a description of them and their vehicle, and they were caught very swiftly after.